synopsis of
There we go.
Okay, all right. Which I'm translating as the synopsis of Mādhyamika. And despite the name of this text, it's really an encyclopedia. It's this massive, massive text. One of the editions that I was working with when I was doing research on this is about 459 pages long. This is a massive text. And in this text, Gorampa is talking about all of the key issues, debates, ideas in the Mādhyamika tradition of Buddhist philosophy. And the way that he does it is he says, okay, here's a topic, here's what a whole bunch of Indian and earlier Tibetan thinkers said about this. Here's who I agree with, and here's who I disagree with, and here's what I think about this. So it's this really extensive, really comprehensive kind of overview of Mādhyamika philosophy. But what I want to focus on today is the very last section of this text. So this is the section of the text where Gorampa explains the final result of Mādhyamika logic and reasoning. So he's talking about the state of Buddhahood, and specifically he's talking about what a Buddha's mind is like. So just to give you context here for this later section of the text, the first 400 or so pages of this text are talking about Mādhyamika philosophy. So talking about two truths, talking about Svatantrika and Prasangika, talking about ethics, talking about all these different sorts of like styles of logic and reasoning, right? The Chatushkoti, all these different sorts of things. I want to pause here just for the folks who are in the room. How many of you, like, am I saying things that you're like, I have no idea what that is? You all at least like know what Mādhyamika is? Okay, I'm seeing a couple of people shaking their head. Don, you know, that's good. Okay. So Mādhyamika is a system of Buddhist philosophy that originated in India. And actually, this is a picture kind of, I guess, maybe representing sort of the start of what would become the Mādhyamika tradition. There's going to be some stuff in this talk where I'm going to get into the weeds a little bit, but I'm going to try as hard as I can to bring folks along. So if there's stuff that you feel like is kind of over your head, just bear with me, because I think you'll still be able to follow along, even if you can't follow along with all the technical terminology. Okay, so going back to Gorampa, so he spends in this text, the synopsis of Mādhyamika, he spends probably the first 400 or so pages talking about all these different kinds of logic and philosophy. And then he spends the last maybe 40 pages, a very, very small section of the text in comparison, talking about the end result of all of this and talking about what this all culminates in. So as we walk through this text, part of why I want to walk us through this is because this is a section of the text that I've been puzzling over for a while, because it's weird. It's just really weird. And once I walk us through kind of what I think is really weird about this text, I'm going to make things a little bit weirder. And what I'm going to do is bring particle physics into the conversation. And I'm going to actually look at what Gorampa says about a Buddha's awakened mind, a Buddha's awakened awareness through the lens of particle physics. Now, I'm not an expert in particle physics. Last time I took a physics class was in high school. But one of the things that I'm really fortunate to have is a community of colleagues where I work at Lawrence University, just up the road. We're a very small school. We have 1,400 students. We're a small liberal arts school. But what that affords me is the ability to have a lot of conversations with people in different departments and different divisions of the university. So part of this talk actually came out of a conversation that I had with my colleague, Megan Pickett, who's an astrophysicist. And basically we had a couple beers one day after work and we started talking about this. And as we started talking, it really shifted my perspective and my way of thinking about these problems in the text that I've been puzzling over for a long time. Okay, so you might think that this whole thing is a cute little intellectual exercise, looking at Mādhyamikas philosophy from the perspective of particle physics. But I want to, because I'm here and I have this time, I want to get on my soapbox for a minute and say that what I'm about to do is an example of something that I think is deeply important right now in the context of higher education and in the context of where we are in the United States in general. I think you're all aware of the sweeping cuts across Wisconsin and across the country to funding for the humanities and for the liberal arts. And these cuts are based on this erroneous assumption, right, that studying the humanities, studying the liberal arts doesn't lead to lucrative careers, right? It doesn't lead to employable skills. And that's why these things are being cut. But we all know, or at least I'm assuming or hoping that you all know, because you're in this room and you chose to come to this talk, that the liberal arts, the humanities are deeply important, right? Studying the humanities, studying the liberal arts teaches us how to think about things from different perspectives. It teaches us to have conversations with people whose ideas might be different from our own. And those are really, really important. So that's a little bit of a digression, but I want to really frame that because I really want to make this point explicit before we get into things. Okay. So now let's look at my friend Gauranga. In the synopsis of the Mādhyamikas, Gauranga argues repeatedly that a fully awakened Buddha doesn't see the world in the same ways as ordinary people. So throughout much of the text, he uses what I think is pretty standard Mādhyamika reasoning. And if you're not familiar with Mādhyamika, just take my word for it. This is pretty standard. And he describes the difference between what Buddhists see and what ordinary people see in negative terms. So here's one example. He says, all objects and subjects which appear dualistically as appearances of objects and subjects are conventional truth. Freedom from conceptual proliferations, which is experienced by the subsiding of dualistic appearances through the meditative equipoise of adhyas, is the ultimate truth. Now, basically what this means is that Buddhas do not engage in dualistic thought and they don't have conceptual proliferations. This means their minds don't function in ways that give rise to conceptual thoughts in the same ways as ordinary persons' minds do. So, like I said, he talks like this through the first 400 pages of the synopsis. But in the last part, the last 40 pages or so, this is when he shifts his strategy. So instead of framing the awareness of Buddhas in negative terms, talking about what they don't see, he shifts and tries to describe what they do see, how their minds do work, right? What they do see. And he does this by means of 5 investigations, Sheba in Tibetan. And these 5 investigations are basically 5 questions. So he says, from the perspective of the Buddha's awakened awareness, Yishi in Tibetan, do the 2 truths exist? Do appearances exist? Does awareness exist? Do mind and mental factors exist? Do arising and ceasing exist? So these are all things that Gauranga talks about earlier in the text, when he's talking about all of this stuff from the perspective of ordinary people. So now he's shifting and saying, okay, do any of these things actually exist for a Buddha in the context of a Buddha's mind? So as he does this, he draws out a distinction between 2 kinds of perspectives. There's the perspective of awakened Buddhas themselves. In Tibetan, this is Dhamma. And then there's the perspectives of other ordinary beings, non-awakened beings, Shinang. So ordinary beings' perspectives of the world can be described as correct or incorrect, depending on the ways that they analyze and understand the world. So the more you analyze the things that you see, the more you analyze phenomena through certain kinds of reasoning and analysis, the more correct your perspective is said to be. Now, awakened Buddhas also see things correctly, but they have a different kind of perspective, and so their way of seeing things correctly is different. Now, I'm not going to get into the background details of all of this, all of the things that are kind of informing Gautampa's perspective here. But I just want to present a general overview of these investigations that Gautampa has. And we're not going to get through all 5 of them, I don't have time, but we'll go through first 2, maybe 3 of them, if we have time. The basic idea is this. There's this kind of relationship between the ways ordinary people see the world and the ways that Buddhists see the world. And what I think might be the best way to describe that relationship is in terms of a kind of asymptotic relationship. This is where we're kind of getting into physics and calculus and all those fun things that I haven't studied since high school. But what I mean by this, right, is if a Buddha's own perspective is understood as the ultimate goal, the final limit of the mind, then the perspectives of ordinary persons are proceeding along a path toward Buddhahood. But an ordinary person's conceptual understanding of the world can never actually arrive at that final limit. An ordinary person's conceptual understanding of the ultimate truth, the ultimate reality, the way things really are, it can always inch closer and closer to that limit, but it can't get there unless there's a radical shift in perspective that happens. So basically what I'm trying to say is I think what Gautama is doing in this section of the text is illustrating for us that rational analysis on its own is not enough to get us to Buddhahood. Okay, so we're going to start with the first of the 5 investigations. And this is where, if you're maybe not as familiar with Mādhyamika, there's a lot of text that's going to be on the next couple of screens, but I will try to walk us through the important points here. So first of all, he talks about the 2 truths. Now, the 2 truths, if you're not familiar, this is important in the context of Mādhyamika philosophy, because having an understanding of what Mādhyamika philosophers call the conventional and ultimate truths is an important framework that the whole Mādhyamika system is based on. So generally speaking, the conventional truth can be described as the ways that things appear to ordinary beings, ordinary persons. I look around this room, I see people, I see furniture, I feel the temperature of the air on my skin, I have thoughts, I'm feeling a little bit hungry, right? All of those things are experiences of the conventional truth or conventional reality. Now, the important thing to understand about the conventional truth is that it's based on this kind of, we could call it a dualistic structure, right? So there's stuff that's perceived and there's someone who's perceiving them. So there's this subject and there are objects. So everything in the conventional truth is structured in terms of that subject-object duality. Now, the ultimate truth, the other of the 2 truths, is the way things really are. It's truth with a capital T. It's reality. And this is what appears to Buddhas. And generally speaking, it's described as a non-dual sort of realization. So all of Mādhyamika philosophy, not just for Gautama, but for everybody, is grounded in this structure, this framework of the 2 truths. So ordinary people see the conventional truth. Awakened Buddhas are capable of realizing the ultimate truth. But the issue is this, right? Buddhas are supposed to be teachers. Buddhas are the beings who are supposed to help guide ordinary folks toward awakening. So there's this question that comes up whether Buddhas are capable of perceiving the conventional truth, right? How can a teacher teach their students if they can't see things in the ways that the students see them? They can't see things from the perspective of their students. So there's this question of, if the conventional truth is based on this dualistic kind of structure, and Buddhas see things in a non-dual way, how can Buddhas interact in the conventional world for the benefit of sentient beings? So this is why this is an important issue for Gautama. This is where he starts with his 5 investigations. So in order to answer this, he looks at the way that the 2 truths have been described in other kinds of Buddhist texts. So he says that when we're talking about statements like the teaching of the doctrine of the Buddhas is based on 2 truths, or all phenomena have 2 natures apprehended by true and false seeing. These come from the Mādhyamika and the Mādhyamika, two very fundamental texts in Tibetan Mādhyamika. So when we're talking about those sorts of things, Gautama says the conventional truth cannot be said to exist for a Buddha. He argues that from a Buddhist perspective, the conventional truth that's taught in these kinds of statements does not exist because without subjective false seeing, there's no object. So what he's saying here is that because a Buddha does not engage in subjective dualistic ways of seeing, there can be no objects that are seen. So dualistic appearances of the conventional truth, appearances in terms of subject and object, cannot exist for a Buddha. But this does not mean that the conventional truth does not exist at all for a Buddha. So he goes on and he says, the conventional truth, which is a part of the inseparability of the two truths, does exist because it's necessarily a part of the two truths. Since these are two truths which appear specifically to a Buddha, they're not synonymous with the two truths that are taught to practitioners. So what Gautama is saying here is that from the perspective of an awakened Buddha, there are no dualistic distinctions. There's no distinction between object and subject, no distinction between the conventional and ultimate truths. So it's incorrect to say that the conventional truth does not exist at all from a Buddhist perspective. From the perspective of a Buddha's awakened awareness, dualistic divisions between conventional and ultimate do not exist. And so they're inseparable. So I want to talk about this word inseparability, zundujupa. This term is a technical term that conveys this sense of inseparability or unity or inextricability. And it occurs a handful of times throughout this text, throughout the synopsis. And it's a term that you can find in Mādhyamika literature, but you see it much more often in tantric texts, in more practice-oriented texts. So when Gautama describes the two truths as zundujupa, from a Buddhist perspective, he's highlighting the idea that Buddhas experience the world in ways that ordinary persons cannot conceive. This has to do with a certain kind of realization. It's a result of a certain kind of practice. So the inseparable two truths for a Buddha are not the same as the two truths that are distinguished by ordinary persons. A Buddha's awakened mind is a special kind of mind, entirely free from dualistic conceptual thought. So it functions in ways that are completely different from the minds of ordinary persons. Okay, so now we'll move on to, you're going to start to see a pattern here. So now we'll move on to the second one, appearances. The issue here is that if a Buddha's mind is entirely free from conceptual proliferations, if a Buddha doesn't have any conceptual thought, then how can there be anything that appears to a Buddha? In order for there to be appearances, even appearances of the inseparable two truths, it seems as though there must be some kind of dualistic distinction that's made between the objects that appear and the subject for whom things appear. And earlier in the text, Gautama has stressed over and over and over again, there are no dualistic distinctions for a Buddha. So this is why this is an important question. So he starts it in this way. And I know this is a lot of text. I will read it here. Some earlier Mādhyamikas assert that appearances are completely non-existent because if appearances were to exist, they would necessarily be associated with distorted appearances. However, this is also not correct. When it is said all objects appear only in endless purity and all objects appear in the dharmadhatu or reality, are these a Buddha's own appearances or are they the appearances that are apprehended by ordinary practitioners? The former contradicts the claim that a Buddha has no appearances, and the latter has the consequence of ultimate purity appearing even for practitioners. Okay, so there are a couple things I want to point out in this passage. So first, this is where we see Gautama bringing up this distinction between Ramang and Shenna, a Buddha's own appearances and the perspective of others, the perspective of ordinary beings. The other point that I want to point out is that Gautama is using certain kinds of phrases. He's using phrases like endless purity and dharmadhatu. Dharmadhatu is a really difficult word to translate, but you can just, for our purposes, you can like reality, truth. So similar to what we saw in the previous investigation, the first investigation, these sorts of phrases are things that we tend to find more often in tantric texts, not so much in Mādhyamika logical reasoning sorts of texts. So what Gautama is saying in this passage is that it's incorrect to assume that once Buddhas overcome their ignorance and they eliminate all of their false and deceptive appearances, they don't have any appearances at all. So he starts by, he's citing a couple of texts to remind his readers that Buddhas are omniscient, and that although their minds are free from conceptual proliferations, all objects of knowledge still appear to them. So we cannot say that Buddhas have no appearances at all. But these appearances have to be different from the dualistic appearances that ordinary persons have, because if that wasn't the case, then ordinary persons would also see the ultimate purity that Buddhas perceive. So basically what Gautama is saying here is Buddhas have appearances, but these are special kinds of appearances. Okay, so then he goes on just a little bit more here. And he says, therefore, although there are no appearances of the conventional truth, which are a part of the two truths taught to practitioners, such as arising, ceasing, and so on, there must be an appearance, which is the appearing ultimate of the inseparability of reality and awareness. Otherwise, if reality did not appear at the time of final meditation on reality, it would follow that the final awareness, which is the appearance of reality, would not exist. So here, just as the conventional and the ultimate are indistinguishable from a Buddhist perspective, so too are the Dharma Dhatu, or reality and awareness. So Yingri-Germe, this is also another technical term here. But this reality is not an object that's perceived by the Buddha because it's indistinguishable from a Buddha's own mind. And Gautama says this must be the case because if it were otherwise, it would be impossible for a Buddha to have any awareness of reality. So again, this phrase, Yingri-Germe, this is particularly striking, again, because we usually see it in tantric texts. But what's really interesting, I think, is this is a phrase that's most commonly associated with Dzogchen literature. And if you know anything about kind of the broader context of the Tibetan traditions in which Gautama is living and existing, he's part of the Sakya tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, which is not really connected to the Dzogchen tantric tradition, or not as explicitly. So this is a really weird thing to see a Sakya philosopher writing about, especially in a Mādhyamika text. This is a phrase that really jumps out and it's really kind of feels a little bit out of place in this text. Okay, so just kind of zooming out here, we can see that by using language that's not associated with what we would expect in Mādhyamika texts, Gautama seems to be signaling that the perspective of a Buddha's awakened awareness is beyond the limits of Mādhyamika analysis. Mādhyamika analysis is insufficient to fully describe a Buddha's awakened mind. So he concludes this part of this particular investigation by saying that for a Buddha, appearances which are dualistic appearances do not exist because disordered karmic imprints are completely abandoned. So although Buddhas do not engage in dualistic appearances, it's incorrect to say that nothing at all appears to a Buddha. Appearances exist for a Buddha, but they're non-dual. Okay, we're gonna quickly go through the third one, and then we're going to kind of zoom out and look at things big picture here. So this next one is about awareness. So if we followed Gautama so far through these first two investigations, we've concluded that from a Buddha's perspective, the two truths exist, but they're not differentiated into two. And appearances exist, but they're not differentiated into subject and object. So the next question is this. If for a Buddha, there's no dualistic distinction between the two truths or between objects and subjects, can we even say that a Buddha has any awareness at all? And how can we say that there's awareness if there are no things to be aware of? So Gautama begins this investigation by citing an opponent who he attributes this to a 12th century Tibetan philosopher named Tsongkhapa. And he says that Tsongkhapa says Buddhas don't have awareness because if they did, there would have to be some kind of dualistic object-subject structuring. But Grompa responds to this point by saying that awareness doesn't necessarily have to be awareness of something else. You can just have a state of awareness. So here's what he says about this. Since the diamond-like meditative stabilization at the end of the mental continuum has burnt the kindling of conceptual proliferations, which comprises objects of knowledge, such as arising, ceasing, permanence, nihilism, and so on, the Dharma Dhatu is the pacification of all conceptual proliferations. And when the previous mental continuum has pacified all conceptual proliferations, such as arising and ceasing, the continuum and the Dharma Dhatu become inseparable, and they are posited as awakened awareness. So here, Grompa is arguing that a Buddha's awakened awareness is brought about through a particular kind of experience. And this experience results in the union of a mind which is free from conceptual proliferations with reality itself, the Dharma Dhatu. And he argues that awakened awareness is cultivated when the diamond-like meditative stabilization, that is, it's the mind of an advanced practitioner, and reality itself are no longer perceived as separate things. When this happens, awakened awareness is not aware of anything. It is simply a state of awareness. So again, what I think is notable here is this distinct shift in Gorampa's writing style, especially if we had time to compare it in more depth to the earlier parts of the synopsis. In the last investigation, he used the phrase ingrigerme, the inseparability of reality and awareness. And here we see Gorampa's prose kind of making a more poetic turn. Right? He's using this metaphor, burning the kindling of conceptual proliferations. This is a reference to Chandrakirti's Mādhyamikas and its commentary. But I think by doing this, by pulling out this kind of metaphoric imagery, he's trying to convey the nature of an experience to his readers. This is not the kind of analytical, rational language that Gorampa uses in other parts of his text or in his other Mādhyamika writings. This language also seems to signal that when we're discussing the nature of a fully awakened Buddha's mind, logical analysis of the Mādhyamika project is insufficient. So hopefully you're starting to see a pattern here, right? So he's once again presenting two answers to this question of does awareness exist, right? So he's saying, well, you know, the Dharma Dhatu is the space where all phenomenal content is capable of existing, but when a Buddha has attained awakening and his mind is in a state of freedom from conceptual proliferations, there is no conceptual content that exists in that space. So basically, I think we could say Gorampa is saying here, fully awakened Buddhas must be understood as having awareness, but that awareness is not anything separate from reality itself. It's not awareness of, it's simply awareness. Okay, so in the interest of time, we're going to skip over the last two, but Gorampa uses similar strategies when he's talking about mind and mental factors and arising and ceasing. These are other things that are important in the context of the Mādhyamika philosophy. Basically, what he says for all of these is that he's kind of hedging his answers, right, in all of these, or he's qualifying his answers with respect to all of these investigations, right? So the two truths appear to the perspective of a Buddha, but they're not differentiated. There are appearances for Buddha, but they're not dualistic appearances in the ways that they appear to others, right? There are appearances from the Buddha's own perspective. A Buddha's awareness exists, but it exists as the inseparability of the Dharma Dhatu and the mind. And then the last two we didn't get to, you can kind of see where he would be going with this. Mind and mental factors exist, but they don't exist as two separate things. Conventional objects, conventional things such as arising and ceasing don't appear to a Buddha as objects, right? But it's still acceptable to say that a Buddha knows all phenomena. And this is all because these things are undifferentiated, non-dual from a Buddhist perspective. Okay, so what does all of this mean? I think that what Gorampa is trying to show us here is that knowledge is not a one-size-fits-all kind of state. Knowledge is contextual, knowledge is relational, and it depends on the being who's engaged in the act of knowing, as well as the objects or the things that are being known, what's being known by the knower. So the two truths, appearances, awareness, mind and mental factors, arising and ceasing, these are all things that can be understood from the perspective of an ordinary person, and they can be said to exist in the context of a Buddha's awakened awareness. But these two kinds of knowledge are different. So, okay, I'm gonna pull back from deep in the Mādhyamika weeds here. We can talk about knowledge in terms of, let's start with an ordinary person's knowledge, right? An ordinary person's knowledge can be correct or it can be incorrect, right? So if I hold up this thing, right, and I say this is a puppy, that's incorrect, right? That's incorrect knowledge of the conventional truth. But if I hold this thing up and I say, well, it's this gray kind of rectangle with some buttons on it, that's correct. That's a correct kind of knowledge of this conventional phenomenon, right? But there are degrees of correctness, right? So, I mean, I could say this is a grayish rectangle, right? Or I could say, this is an iPad, right? Or this is an iPad. Well, this is the case. This is the iPad, right? You know what I'm talking about, right? I could say this is an iPad, or I could say this is an iPad Air 29, or I don't know what it is, right? But I could do some investigation and figure that out, right? And I could be more correct. I could investigate more. I could learn something about the circuitry involved. I could learn something about the working conditions of the people who manufacture the parts. I could learn something about Apple's profit margins, right? The more I investigated, the more I could learn about this, the more correct my knowledge of this conventional entity could be said to be. Now, because we're in Mādhyamika land, I could study this even further, and I could investigate this through Mādhyamika analysis. And so I could spend time thinking about, is this iPad truly existent or non-existent or both or neither? I could investigate the causal processes that led to the arising and the eventual decay of this iPad, right? I could contemplate the interdependent nature of this iPad. There are all these different ways that I could investigate this iPad. And in all of that investigation, the more I learn about this particular iPad, the more correct I am. Right? The more knowledge I have, so I'm kind of progressing along this path toward being more correct. That's more correct than saying this is a grayish rectangle, right? So, from the Mādhyamika perspective, the more I analyze not just this iPad, but all these things around me and all the things that I experience, the more knowledge I gain, and the more knowledge you gain, the further you can advance on the Buddhist path, on the path toward Buddhahood, on the path toward awakening. So there's a certain kind of relationship between the amount of analysis that someone does and one's proximity to Buddhahood. And I've already kind of prefaced this at the beginning of my talk, but this is one way we could think about this relationship, right? So as you refine your knowledge through rational analysis, you move closer to Buddhahood. Right? So I don't know if you can all see this, right? This is this axis is kind of how much you analyze, and this is kind of how correct you are, right? So Buddhahood, awakened awareness is somewhere up here. That's the limit that you're trying to get to. But Gorampa's investigations, the way Gorampa talks about this, illustrate that the relationship between an ordinary person's knowledge and a Buddha's awakened awareness is not linear like this, right? And this is why I think he uses unorthodox language and terminology that's not commonly found in Mādhyamika philosophy. This is why he's using tantric terms and metaphors and poetic imagery when he's describing a Buddha's awakened awareness. It's possible for an ordinary person's knowledge of conventional phenomena to grow more and more refined. There's always more to learn. There's always more to study. But Gautama is trying to show us through this unconventional language that he's using at the end of the synopsis that that awakened awareness is the result of a radical transformation of the mind. This transformation depends on a certain amount of rational analysis. That's important, but it also requires a shift in perspective. And that shift comes from practice. It comes from actually engaging in one's experience of phenomena rather than just analyzing it. And this is where ethical conduct and meditation come into play on the Buddhist path. Now, this eventual shift in perspective is so distinctive that it cannot be accurately conveyed through language. And this is why Gautama is using this unconventional terminology. His 5 investigations are gesturing toward the limits of Mādhyamika philosophy and rational conceptual thought. So if we keep Gautama's investigations in mind, I think we might be better off to consider the relationship between ordinary knowledge and awakened awareness more like this. So ordinary knowledge can approach awakened awareness, and it can inch ever and ever closer to an approximation of what that realization of the ultimate might be like, but it's never going to arrive at that limit. So that's why I think it's helpful to think about this as existing in a kind of asymptotic relationship, these two kinds of knowledge. So this is where I think maybe a little bit of physics can help us out. So I want to compare this relationship between ordinary knowledge and awakened awareness to discussions in physics about special relativity and theories about what time and space look like from the perspective of a photon that's traveling at the speed of light. So according to the special theory of relativity, as something speeds up, time and space contracts, right? Time slows and distances shrink, I should say. So as the particle approaches at the speed of light, time slows to almost nothing and distances shrink to almost nothing. Now, physicists theorize that from the perspective of a particle that travels at the speed of light, the universe is timeless and dimensionless. But this doesn't mean that time and space don't exist, right? It just means that time and space only exist from the perspective of non-photons that are traveling at speeds slower than the speed of light. So scientists use mathematical equations to approximate this. So this is the formula, or so I have been told. Right? But here's what we need to understand about this formula. So C here, this is the speed of light. V is the speed of the particle that we're considering, right? So as this number gets closer and closer to the speed of light, we can kind of use math to approximate sort of what's happening in terms of time. But what happens when this speed is equivalent to the speed of light? You end up with a situation where you have 1 minus, well, c squared over c squared, which is 1, that's 0. And you can't divide by 0, right? Math doesn't let us divide by 0. So we can say, here we go, I have another graph here. So we can say that a scientist's mathematical theories can approximate the perspective of a photon. And with mathematical analysis, right, we get closer and closer to that limit. This is the limit, right? We can inch ever closer. But math is never going to get us to that limit. It's impossible for mathematical language to describe what time and space look like from the perspective of a photon that's moving at the speed of light. So I think this little foray into physics can help us better understand what Gautama is doing. Right, Gautama is saying from the perspective of an awakened Buddha, there are no conceptual proliferations. There's no duality, right? At this final limit of Buddhahood, concepts and language related to the conventional truth no longer work. But this doesn't mean that the conventional doesn't exist at all. It's just that they only exist from the perspective of non-awakened beings, right? Who are approaching Buddhahood. They're on the path to Buddhahood, but they're not there. So to close here, I think what we can learn from this is that a Buddha's awakened awareness is infinitely knowledgeable and infinitely compassionate. But this doesn't necessarily mean that Buddhas know all things or that they have compassion for all beings, because that would involve knowing things, right? That would involve a dualistic sort of thing. So from a Buddha's own perspective, Rangnam, of awakened awareness, there's no distinction between knowing and objects of knowing, or between compassion and objects of compassion. They're simply knowledge and compassion, indistinguishable from a Buddha's own awareness. This is impossible for ordinary persons to conceive, just as it's impossible for ordinary mathematics to divide something by 0. But I think this does not mean that it's incorrect to say that Buddhas are, this does not mean that it's incorrect to say that Buddhas are all-knowing or have compassion for all beings, right? From the perspective of other kinds of beings, Shenna, who engage in rational analysis, we can approximate this limit of Buddhahood by continuing to know and understand things more deeply, and by cultivating compassion more fully. So the more things that an ordinary person can know, and the more beings toward whom she can be compassionate, the closer she can approach to Buddhahood. And I think this is precisely the practical application of Mādhyamika philosophy. The actual limit of Mādhyamika is inconceivable, it's indescribable, it's incomprehensible. But Mādhyamikas can still approach that limit. They can always get closer to that limit, no matter where they might be on their path to awakening. So I think this asymptotic curve of Shenhang means that ordinary Mādhyamikas, as long as they exist in the world, can always work to be more compassionate, more knowledgeable as they progress toward awakening. So I'll stop there.